It's October 3rd, 1942. A secluded island on the Baltic coast of Germany called Peenemünde. The air was cold and smelled of pine resin and salt spray. Standing on a concrete launch pad was a shape that looked like it had been ripped from the pages of a science fiction pulp novel. It was a black and white checkered cylinder, standing 46 feet tall, steaming with the vapors of liquid oxygen. It had no wings. It had no propeller. It was the Aggregate 4, later to be known to the world as the V2. Watching from a bunker a safe distance away was a young, charismatic aristocrat named Wernher von Braun. He was barely 30 years old, yet he was the technical director of the most expensive secret weapons program in the Third Reich. Next to him stood General Walter Dornberger. They held their breath as the countdown reached 0. With a roar that shook the island, the engine ignited. Unlike an airplane that claws its way into the sky, the A4 rose slowly at first, balancing on a pillar of Mach diamond flame, before accelerating violently straight up. It pierced the clouds. It reached an altitude of 53 miles, touching the edge of space, before crashing into the sea 120 miles away. General Dornberger turned to von Braun and uttered a sentence that would echo through history. Today, the spaceship was born, but unfortunately, it has landed on the wrong planet. This story is perhaps the most morally complex tale of World War II. It is not about brave soldiers holding a line. It is about brilliant scientists who made a pact with the devil. It is the story of how the dream of spaceflight was funded by the nightmare of the Nazi regime. It is the story of the V2, the first man-made object to leave the atmosphere, built to destroy London, but destined to build the path to the moon. To understand how Germany, a nation banning Jewish physics, became the leader in rocket science, we have to go back to a loophole. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I, forbade Germany from developing heavy artillery, tanks, or air forces. But the treaty writers in 1919 had forgotten to mention one thing: rockets. At the time, rockets were seen as fireworks or toys. The German army, looking for any way to rearm legally, noticed this omission. They began to funnel secret funds into a strange new hobby that was sweeping the Weimar Republic. In the 1920s, inspired by the movies of Fritz Lang like Woman in the Moon, a group of amateur enthusiasts formed the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, VFR, the Society for Space Travel. They were dreamers. They built crude rockets in a dump outside Berlin called the Raketenflugplatz, Rocket Airport. They wore welding goggles and tweed suits. They blew up engines. They lost fingers. They drank beer and talked about Mars. Among them was the young Wernher von Braun. He was a prodigy, a baron's son who could play Beethoven on the piano from memory and solve differential calculus equations for fun. He didn't care about politics. He didn't care about war. He only cared about one thing: getting off the earth. But dreams require money. Liquid oxygen is expensive. Precision machining is expensive. By 1932, the amateur club was broke. Then the men in the black leather trench coats arrived. The German army offered von Braun a deal. They would give him unlimited funding. They would give him a doctoral degree. They would build him the greatest laboratory in the world. All he had to do was stop building spaceships and start building weapons. Von Braun accepted. He later justified it by saying, the rocket worked perfectly, except for landing on the wrong planet. But in 1932, he put on the uniform of the German war machine and began to militarize his dream. The facility the Nazis built for him was Peenemünde. It was a scientific utopia hidden in a forest. It had the best wind tunnels in Europe. It had the first supersonic measurement systems. It employed thousands of the brightest minds in Germany. For years, while the rest of the world fought with piston engines and propellers, the team at Peenemünde was solving problems that no one else even knew existed. They had to invent a fuel pump that could move 50 gallons of explosive alcohol and liquid oxygen per second. They had to invent a guidance system, an inertial platform with gyroscopes that could steer a missile at 3,500 miles per hour, faster than any human pilot could react. They had to invent the materials that wouldn't melt as the rocket re-entered the atmosphere, glowing red hot from friction. The engineering challenge was immense. The V2 was not just a bomb. It was a robotic suicide machine. It had 30,000 parts. If one valve froze, if one relay chattered, the rocket would explode on the pad or tumble out of the sky. Throughout 1939 and 1940, failure was the norm. Rockets exploded on ignition. They flew horizontally and crashed into the scientists' bunkers. They spun out of control like fireworks. Hitler was unimpressed. He called the rocket an expensive artillery shell. He cut the priority of the program. But then the war turned. The defeat at Stalingrad, the stalemate in Africa, the Allied bombing of German cities. Hitler needed a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon. He needed something that could strike terror into the British without risking German pilots. He needed a weapon against which there was no defense. When Dornberger showed Hitler a color movie of a successful launch in 1943, the dictator was mesmerized. He saw the phallic power of the rocket, the unstoppable ascent. He ordered immediate mass production. He wanted thousands of them raining down on London. But there was a problem. Peenemünde was a research lab, not a factory. To build thousands of these incredibly complex machines required a massive industrial workforce, and Germany's men were all at the front. The solution proposed by the SS was monstrous. If German workers weren't available, they would use slaves. They would not build the rockets in Peenemünde, which was vulnerable to bombers. They would build them underground, in a mountain in the Harz region. This decision marked the transition of the V2 from a scientific marvel into an instrument of absolute evil. The focus shifted from the clean white coats of the scientists to the striped pajamas of the concentration camp inmates. Von Braun, the dreamer of Mars, was now an officer in the SS. He visited the tunnels, he saw the conditions, he knew exactly what the price of his spaceship was. And as the first operational V2s were prepared for launch against Paris and London in September 1944, the world was about to be introduced to the age of the ballistic missile, a war where death arrives in total silence, faster than the speed of sound. By late 1943, the British Royal Air Force had discovered the secret testing grounds at Peenemünde. In a massive night raid known as Operation Hydra, nearly 600 heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on the island. They killed scientists, destroyed drawing offices, and shattered the illusion that the German rocket program was untouchable. But the raid failed to kill the V2. Instead, it drove the weapon underground, into a nightmare that would far eclipse the violence of the bombing itself. Deep in the Harz mountains of central Germany, near the town of Nordhausen, lay an abandoned gypsum mine inside the Kohnstein Hill. It consisted of 2 parallel tunnels, each over a mile long, connected by dozens of cross-galleries like the rungs of a giant ladder. This was the site chosen by the SS for the Mittelwerk, the Central Works. It was to be the largest underground factory in the world, bomb-proof, impenetrable, and staffed by a workforce that cost nothing and could be worked until death. In August 1943, the first trainloads of prisoners arrived from the Buchenwald concentration camp to begin the conversion of the tunnels. They were political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, and Soviet POWs. They were driven into the dark, damp caves by SS guards armed with whips and dogs. For months, they did not see the sun. They slept in the tunnels on wooden planks stacked 4 high, breathing air thick with rock dust and blasting fumes. There was no running water. There were no toilets, only oil drums cut in half. The lice and dysentery were rampant. In these conditions, they were forced to blast and clear millions of tons of rock to widen the galleries for the assembly lines. The mortality rate was staggering. The SS doctrine was Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion while carrying a heavy steel girder, he was beaten to death, or simply left to die in the rubble. His body was thrown onto a cart and replaced by a fresh prisoner from the next train. It is estimated that 20,000 prisoners died in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, a number that exceeds the total number of people killed by the V2 rocket in actual combat. The V2 holds the unique and horrific distinction of being the only weapon system in history that killed more people during its production than by its detonation. Into this hell came the cutting-edge technology of the Third Reich. The contrast was jarring and surreal. In the main assembly hall, under the flickering electric lights, stood the gleaming high-tech shapes of the V2 rockets, painted in olive drab or camouflage. Walking among the starving, ragged skeletons of the prisoners were the German civilian engineers and scientists, wearing clean white lab coats or business suits, carrying clipboards, checking tolerances with micrometers. Wernher von Braun himself visited the Mittelwerk multiple times. He walked past the piles of bodies. He saw the hangings in the galleries, prisoners executed for sabotage, suspended from the cranes used to lift the rocket engines. He later claimed he was helpless to stop it, a prisoner of the SS himself, but the records show he demanded more workers when production lagged. The dream of spaceflight had become a purely industrial atrocity. Despite the horror, the factory worked. The assembly line was a marvel of organization. Raw materials entered one end of the tunnel, aluminum, steel, alcohol, liquid oxygen tanks, and finished V-2 rockets rolled out the other end on railway cars, ready for war. At its peak, the Mittelwerk was producing 30 rockets every day. But the prisoners fought back in the only way they could: sabotage. It was a dangerous game. If a prisoner was caught tampering with a part, he was hanged immediately. But the V-2 was an incredibly complex machine with 30,000 components. A loose screw, a piece of wire insulation stripped away, or a handful of sand in a fuel pump could cause the rocket to fail. The most common form of sabotage was urinating on the guidance electronics. The acid in the urine would dry, leaving no trace, but weeks later, when the rocket was powered up for launch, the circuitry would short out. This silent resistance meant that a significant percentage of V-2s either exploded on the launch pad or broke up in mid-air, saving thousands of lives in London and Antwerp. By September 1944, the V-2 was finally ready for combat. But unlike the V-1 flying bomb, which required massive fixed concrete launch ramps that Allied bombers could easily spot and destroy, the V-2 was designed to be mobile. The Germans had learned the lesson of air superiority. They knew they could not build fixed bases, so they created the Mittelwerk. This was a specialized trailer that carried the 14-ton rocket horizontally. The launch units, known as Artillerieabteilungen, operated like a traveling circus of destruction. They would convoy into a forest or a city park under the cover of darkness. They would find a small patch of flat ground. It could be a road, a basketball court, or a clearing in the trees. In less than 90 minutes, they would erect the rocket vertically using the hydraulic arm of the Mittelwerk. They would pump in the fuel, a mixture of alcohol and water, and the oxidizer, liquid oxygen. They would align the gyroscope platform, and then they would fire. On September 8, 1944, at 6:43 p.m., the residents of Chiswick, a quiet suburb of West London, were preparing for dinner. The Blitz was over. The V-1 attacks had slowed down. The war seemed to be ending. Suddenly, the entire neighborhood shook. There was no air raid siren. There was no sound of an approaching plane. There was simply a massive, earth-shattering explosion that dug a crater 30 feet deep and demolished a row of houses. 3 people were killed instantly. 17 were injured. And then, after the explosion, came the sound. Observers described a terrifying double crack, or a sound like a giant whip being cracked in the sky, followed by a rushing noise that sounded like a train passing overhead. This was the physics of supersonic warfare. The V-2 fell from the edge of space at 3,500 miles per hour, nearly 5 times the speed of sound. It moved faster than the sound waves it created. If you heard the V-2 coming, you were already alive. If it hit you, you never heard it. The British government was baffled. At first, they tried to cover it up, claiming it was a gas main explosion. They didn't want to admit that the Germans had a weapon against which there was absolutely no defense. You couldn't shoot down a V-2. It fell too fast for anti-aircraft guns. It was too small for radar to track in time. Spitfires couldn't catch it. Once the engine cut off during the ascent in Germany or Holland, the rocket became a dumb object, following a ballistic parabola. It was essentially a meteorite made of steel and explosives. The psychological terror of the V-2 was different from the Blitz. In 1940, you heard the sirens. You had time to run to a shelter. You could fight back. With the V-2, death was random and instant. It could happen while you were sleeping, walking to work, or reading a newspaper. There was no warning, no preparation, and no safety. Londoners began to look at the sky differently. The silence became more frightening than the noise. The mobile launch teams proved incredibly difficult to hunt. Allied fighter bombers, the Typhoons and Mustangs, roamed the Dutch countryside looking for the telltale plume of smoke. But by the time a pilot spotted the smoke trail of a launch, the rocket was already in the stratosphere, and the German crew was already packing up the Meilerwagen to move to a new hiding spot. They used the forests of The Hague as camouflage. They hid under trees during the day and launched at night. It was a game of cat and mouse where the mouse had a weapon that could punch a hole in a city from 200 miles away. As the attacks intensified, hitting not just London but also the vital Allied supply port of Antwerp in Belgium, the V-2 became the priority target for the Allied air forces. But bombing the forests was ineffective. The only way to stop the V-2 was to overrun the launch sites with tanks and infantry. The Warforge of the Allies had to grind its way forward on the ground to stop the space weapon of the Nazis. Meanwhile, back in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, the pace of production accelerated, even as the Third Reich collapsed. The SS ordered the prisoners to work faster. They began building other weapons in the tunnels, jet engines for the Heinkel 162, parts for the V1. The factory became a dystopian city, sealed off from the reality of the losing war outside. Von Braun and his team continued to refine the guidance systems, dreaming of future rockets that could cross the Atlantic to hit New York, the theoretical A9A-10 missile. They were detached from the suffering, focused only on the engineering data, recording the impact points in London not as tragedies, but as data points on a graph of accuracy. But the end was coming. In early 1945, the sound of Soviet artillery could be heard in the east, and American tanks were approaching from the west. The SS began to prepare for the evacuation of the scientists and the destruction of the evidence. The V-2 program was about to transition from a weapon of war into the ultimate prize of the peace. The race to capture the technology and the men who built it was about to begin. April 11, 1945. The tanks of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division were advancing through the Harz Mountains in central Germany. They were battle-hardened troops, accustomed to the sight of death after fighting from Normandy to the Elbe. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found near the town of Nordhausen. As the GIs approached the perimeter of the Boelke Kaserne, the barracks for the Mittelwerk factory, they smelled it before they saw it. It was a stench of decay so thick it made the tank crews gag inside their steel turrets. When they smashed through the gates, they found a scene that looked like the end of the world. Thousands of corpses were stacked in piles, rotting in the spring sun. The survivors were walking skeletons, eyes vacant, too weak to cheer. They were the slaves who had built the V-2. The American soldiers were enraged. They had found the dark heart of the Nazi war machine. But just a few miles away, at the entrance to the tunnels under the Kronstein Hill, a different group of Americans was arriving. These were not combat infantry. They were technical intelligence officers, part of the Special Mission V-2 team led by Colonel Holger Toftoy. Their orders were secret, and they were morally complicated. While the medics were treating the dying prisoners, Toftoy's men were hunting for the machines that had killed them. They drove their jeeps into the massive tunnels of the Mittelwerk. The electric lights were still humming, the assembly lines were intact, and there, stretching into the darkness, were rows and rows of finished V-2 rockets, standing on railway cars like silent sentinels. The intelligence officers were stunned. They walked past the hanging cranes and the tools dropped by the prisoners. They touched the cold steel of the combustion chambers. They realized they were looking at technology that was decades ahead of anything in the Allied arsenal. The guidance gyroscopes were masterpieces of precision. The fuel pumps were engineering marvels. They knew immediately that whoever possessed this factory would rule the future of warfare. But there was a massive geopolitical problem. Under the Yalta Agreement signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the region of Nordhausen and the Mittelwerk factory fell squarely into the Soviet zone of occupation. The Red Army was less than 100 miles away. In a few weeks, this entire treasure trove would legally belong to Joseph Stalin. Colonel Toftoy made a decision that would change history. He decided to loot the factory. He didn't ask for permission from the diplomats. He ordered his men to round up every available railcar in the region. He organized the German railway workers, many of whom were still terrified of the SS, to start loading the V-2 parts. They didn't take the finished rockets, which were too large and often sabotaged. They took the components. They stripped the Mittelwerk of everything. 100 complete sets of parts, tons of documents, blueprints and specialized machine tools. It was the greatest industrial heist of the war. For days, the Americans worked feverishly, loading 341 train cars. Just hours before the Soviet vanguard arrived to take control of the sector, the last train chugged westward into the American zone. When the Russian technical teams finally entered the Mittelwerk, they found an empty shell. They were furious. They found only scrap metal and the bodies of the prisoners. The Americans had stolen the hardware. Now they needed the software, the brains. Hundreds of miles to the south, in the Bavarian Alps, the software was hiding in a luxury hotel. Wernher von Braun and his core team of 500 scientists and engineers had fled Peenemünde months earlier. They were essentially fugitives, carrying crates of the most valuable technical data in the world. The SS watched them closely. Orders from Berlin stated that if the scientists were in danger of being captured, they were to be executed. The Nazis did not want their secrets falling into Allied hands. Von Braun was playing a dangerous game. He knew the war was over. He gathered his top lieutenants in a secret meeting and posed a question. To whom shall we surrender? The choices were grim. The French would likely execute them for the bombardment of Paris. The British were still furious about the V2 attacks on London and might put them on trial as war criminals. The Russians were an enigma, but the German fear of the Bolshevik hordes was absolute. Von Braun looked at his team and said, "We despise the French. We are mortally afraid of the Soviets. We do not believe the British can afford us. Therefore, we go to the Americans." It was a calculated decision. Von Braun gambled that the Americans, rich and pragmatic, would prioritize the technology over justice. He was betting that his value as a scientist would outweigh his guilt as an SS officer. On May 2nd, 1945, as the snow melted in the Alps, the gamble played out. Private First Class Fred Schneikert of the U.S. 44th Infantry Division was standing guard on a mountain road near Reuter, Austria. Out of the mist walked a man in a long leather coat. It was Magnus von Braun, Wernher's brother. He spoke English. He approached the stunned GI and said, "My name is Magnus von Braun. My brother invented the V2. We want to surrender." The Americans didn't shoot. They were elated. They had captured the biggest intellectual prize of the war. Wernher von Braun played his part perfectly. When he met the American press and intelligence officers, he was charming, well-dressed, and spoke fluent English. He posed for photos with smiling U.S. generals. He talked about satellites and space stations. He didn't talk about the Mittelwerk. He didn't talk about the 20,000 dead slaves. He spun a narrative that he was a man of science, a reluctant participant in the Nazi regime, a dreamer who just wanted to reach the stars. The Americans, desperate for his knowledge to fight the looming Cold War against the Soviets, accepted the story. They scrubbed his record. This was the beginning of Operation Paperclip. The U.S. Army Special Services smuggled von Braun and over 100 of his top scientists out of Europe. They brought them to Fort Bliss, Texas, along with the trainloads of V2 parts stolen from the Mittelwerk. It was a culture shock. The German aristocrats found themselves living in wooden barracks in the desert, eating in an army mess hall, watched by guards who had fought against them just months before. But they had their rockets. In the deserts of New Mexico, at the White Sands Proving Ground, they began to assemble the captured V2s. Meanwhile, the Soviets were scrambling to catch up. They were furious at being cheated out of the prize at Nordhausen. Stalin ordered his own version of Paperclip, Operation Osoaviakim. On a single night in October 1946, Soviet soldiers rounded up thousands of remaining German low-level technicians, engineers, and their families at gunpoint. They were loaded onto trains and shipped deep into Russia to work in isolation. The Soviets had the blueprints and the workers, but they lacked the visionary leadership of von Braun. This division of the German rocket team set the stage for the space race. The V2 had split into two lineages, the American and the Soviet. In 1946, the first American-launched V2 roared into the New Mexico sky. It reached an altitude of 100 miles. It took the first photo of Earth from space. The scientists were jubilant, but for the survivors of London and Antwerp, And for the few survivors of the Mittelwerk concentration camp, the sight of the V2 rising on a pillar of fire in the American desert was a bitter pill to swallow. The weapon that had destroyed their families was now the darling of the American military. Justice had been sacrificed on the altar of progress. The V2 program in America was not just about testing captured weapons. It was a transfer of knowledge. The German scientists taught the Americans everything: how to handle liquid oxygen, how to calculate trajectories, how to build gyroscopes. The V2 became the grandfather of every American missile. The Redstone rocket, which would eventually carry the first American astronaut into space, was a direct, scaled-up descendant of the Nazi weapon. The Atlas, the Titan, the Saturn, they all shared DNA with the weapon built in the dark tunnels of the Harz Mountains. But the legacy of the V2 wasn't just technical. It was the beginning of the military-industrial complex. It proved that if you wanted to build a machine capable of leaving the Earth, you needed the resources of a superpower. The era of the lone inventor in a garage was over. The era of the state-sponsored mega-project had begun, and standing at the center of it all was Wernher von Braun, the man who had shaken hands with Hitler and was now shaking hands with President Eisenhower, the man who had successfully sold the moon to two different empires. In the final chapter of this series, we will look at the ultimate evolution of this technology. We will trace the path from the V2 striking London to the Saturn V launching to the moon. We will ask the hard questions about the morality of scientific advancement and whether the footprint on the lunar surface washes away the blood on the floor of the Mittelwerk. The V2 was a weapon of vengeance, but its children would become vessels of exploration. 1946, the White Sands Proving Ground, New Mexico. The landscape was alien, a blinding expanse of white gypsum sand dunes that looked more like the surface of the moon than the Earth. In the center of this desolation stood a familiar, ominous shape. It was a V2 rocket, freshly painted in yellow and black visibility patterns, stripped of its explosive warhead and packed with scientific instruments. Around it, speaking in rapid-fire German, were the same men who had launched these weapons at London just 2 years earlier. They were adjusting the graphite rudders, checking the turbopumps, and calculating trajectories with slide rules. Standing guard around them were American MPs. It was a scene of deep historical irony. The United States Army was funding, feeding, and protecting the architects of the Blitz because the war forge had shifted its focus. The enemy was no longer Berlin, it was Moscow. The launch of V2 No. 3 on May 10, 1946, was a spectacle that signaled the beginning of a new era. When the engine ignited, the roar rolled across the desert floor, a sound of raw power that American scientists had never heard before. The rocket climbed to an altitude of 70 miles. It carried a cosmic ray detector. For the first time, humanity was probing the environment of space not with balloons, but with ballistic power. But for the American generals watching through binoculars, the science was secondary. They were watching the birth of the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, ICBM. They realized that if this rocket could carry a 1-ton warhead 200 miles, a larger version could carry an atomic bomb 5,000 miles. The V2 was the proof of concept for the end of the world. While the Americans were launching captured rockets, the Soviets were busy reverse engineering them. In a secret facility near Moscow, a man known only as the chief designer, Sergei Korolev, was staring at the blueprints of the V2. Korolev was a survivor of Stalin's Gulag, a man who had lost his teeth to scurvy and his health to torture. He hated the Germans, but he respected their engineering. Stalin demanded an immediate replica of the V2. The Soviet result was the R-1 rocket. To the naked eye, it was identical to the German weapon. It used the same alcohol-oxygen mix, the same graphite steering vanes, the same shape. But Korolev was not content with copying. He saw the flaws in von Braun's design. He saw the structural weight that could be shaved off. He saw the inefficiency of the alcohol fuel. By 1950, the race had diverged. The Americans, confident in their heavy bombers like the B-36 and B-52, treated rockets as an interesting experiment, but not a strategic priority. They allowed von Braun and his team to languish in the desert, launching V2s for upper atmosphere research. Von Braun was frustrated. He felt unused. He was a man of immense ambition who had sold his soul to reach the stars, and now he was stuck launching weather instruments in New Mexico. He realized that to get the funding he needed for his true dream, space travel, he needed to sell the idea to the American public. He needed to become a celebrity. This marked the beginning of one of the most successful public relations campaigns in history. Wernher von Braun, the former SS major, reinvented himself as the kindly, visionary professor. He teamed up with Collier's magazine to publish a series of dazzling articles about space stations and moon rockets. But his masterstroke was partnering with Walt Disney. In 1955, millions of American families gathered around their television sets to watch the Man in Space episodes on the Disneyland show. There on the screen, using a pointer and models, was von Braun. He was charismatic, handsome, and authoritative. He explained how a multi-stage rocket could leave the Earth's gravity. He didn't mention the slave labor. He didn't mention the V2 impacts in Antwerp. He barely mentioned Germany. Disney had sanitized him. He was now America's missile man. This whitewashing of history was a deliberate policy of the US government. The Cold War was heating up. The Soviets had detonated their own atomic bomb in 1949. The Korean War had broken out in 1950. The United States needed von Braun's brain more than it needed justice for the victims of the Holocaust. The Department of Justice kept the files on the Mittelwerk sealed. When survivors tried to raise the issue, they were ignored. The narrative was strictly controlled. Von Braun was a scientist caught in a bad system, a dreamer who had no choice. It was a lie, but it was a necessary lie for the military-industrial complex. However, the Soviet Union was not sleeping. While von Braun was on TV, Korolev was building hardware. The Soviets, lacking the massive strategic bomber fleet of the Americans, bet everything on rockets. They took the V2 design and scaled it up monstrously. They built the R2, then the R5, and finally the R7 Semyorka. The R7 was a cluster of V2-derived engines strapped together. It was huge. It had enough power to throw a thermonuclear warhead from Moscow to Washington. And on October 4th, 1957, that same rocket threw something else into the sky: Sputnik. The launch of Sputnik was a Pearl Harbor moment for American science. The faint beep-beep-beep of the Soviet satellite passing over the United States shattered the illusion of American technological superiority. The public panicked. If the Soviets could put a metal ball over Chicago, they could put a nuke over Chicago. The Warforge of America suddenly realized it had been outproduced by the communist system. The blame game began in Washington. Why did we lose? We have the German scientists. We have von Braun. The answer was that they hadn't let von Braun build what he wanted. He had been designing the Redstone rocket, a direct, potent descendant of the V2, for the army. But the government had forbidden him from launching a satellite, fearing it would militarize space. Now, the gloves were off. The army ordered von Braun to launch. On January 31st, 1958, a Redstone rocket, modified as the Jupiter C, lifted off from Cape Canaveral carrying Explorer 1. It was America's first satellite. Wernher von Braun was hailed as a national hero. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was given the keys to the city. The man who had hung medals on his SS uniform was now the savior of the free world. But beneath the celebration of space exploration lay the grim reality of the technology. Every rocket that launched a satellite or an astronaut was essentially a modified weapon. The Atlas rocket that carried John Glenn to orbit was designed as an ICBM to kill millions of people. The Titan rocket was a silo-based weapon of mass destruction. The lineage was unbreakable. Whether it was the Soviet R7 or the American Redstone, if you stripped away the paint and the flags, you found the skeleton of the V2. The turbo pumps, the combustion chambers, the gyroscopes. The heart of the machine was still German. As the 1960s began, President John F. Kennedy made his famous pledge to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. To achieve this, NASA needed a rocket of unimaginable power. They needed something that could lift 3,000 tons off the ground. There was only one man in the world capable of managing a project of that magnitude. Wernher von Braun was made the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. His task was to build the Saturn V. Huntsville became known as Rocket City. It was a surreal place where German scientists lived in suburban American houses, holding barbecues and attending PTA meetings, while designing the most powerful machine in human history. The shadow of the Mittelwerk was far away, buried in the past. But the engineering philosophy remained the same. Von Braun ran his American team with the same ruthless efficiency he had used in Peenemünde. He demanded perfection. He tested components until they broke. He knew that unlike the V2, which was expendable, the Saturn V would carry human lives. The V2 had evolved. It had grown from a 46-foot weapon of terror into a 363-foot vessel of exploration. But the fundamental question remained. Was the journey to the stars worth the moral cost of its origin? As the massive F1 engines of the Saturn V were being tested, shaking the ground of Alabama with 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the ghosts of 20,000 prisoners in the Harz Mountains were still waiting for their story to be told. The final chapter of the V2 story would be written not on Earth, but on the Sea of Tranquility, July 16, 1969, Cape Kennedy, Florida. 1 million people have gathered on the beaches and causeways to witness history. In the firing room, the tension is palpable. At the center of the control consoles stands Dr. Wernher von Braun. He is older now, his hair graying, but his eyes are fixed on the monitors with the same intensity he had at Peenemünde 27 years earlier. On the launch pad, shimmering in the heat haze, stands the Saturn V. It is a machine that defies comprehension. It stands 363 feet tall, 60 feet taller than the Statue of Liberty. It weighs 6.5 million pounds fully fueled. At its base are 5 F1 engines, the most powerful rocket engines ever built. When they ignite, they will consume 15 tons of fuel per second. They will generate 7.5 million pounds of thrust, more power than 85 Hoover dams. At 9:32 a.m., the countdown reaches 0. The engines ignite. The sound is not just noise, it is a physical event. It cracks concrete. It sets off seismographs in New York. Slowly, majestically, the giant rises. It clears the tower. It pierces the sky. Riding on top of this pillar of fire are 3 American astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. They are riding the ultimate descendant of the V2. The engineering lineage is undeniable. The turbopumps that feed the F1 engines are scaled-up versions of the pumps designed in Germany in 1940. The guidance computer, though infinitely more advanced, operates on the same inertial principles as the A4 guidance unit. The aerodynamic shape, the staging concepts, the use of liquid oxygen, it all traces back to the blackboard drawings of the Verein für Raumschifffahrt. The Saturn V is the V2's grandson, grown to mythical proportions. 4 days later, on July 20th, 1969, the lunar module Eagle touched down on the Sea of Tranquility. Neil Armstrong descended the ladder and spoke the words that united the human species. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. In Huntsville, Alabama, Wernher von Braun was carried on the shoulders of the cheering crowd. He was the hero of the century. He had fulfilled the dream of ages. He had broken the chains of gravity. But history has a way of unearthing buried truths. As the Cold War thawed and the archives were opened, the dark origins of the space program began to surface. In the 1980s, the U.S. Department of Justice finally investigated the scientists brought over under Operation Paperclip. The full extent of the atrocities at Mittelwerk was revealed to the public. Survivors of the Dora concentration camp came forward to testify. They identified the scientists who had walked past them in the tunnels, the men who had stepped over dead bodies to inspect circuit boards. Von Braun died in 1977, before the full weight of public scrutiny could fall on him. But his legacy was forever tarnished. The question was no longer how did he do it, but was it worth it? The moral calculus of the V2 is the most difficult equation of the 20th century. Without the V2, there would have been no ICBMs. Without ICBMs, there would have been no mutually assured destruction, MADI, the doctrine that arguably prevented World War III. Without the V2, there would have been no Sputnik, no NASA, no moon landing, no GPS satellites, no weather satellites. The modern world is built on the infrastructure of space. and that infrastructure rests on a foundation laid by slave labor in a Nazi mountain. The historian Michael Neufeld captured the paradox perfectly when he wrote, "The V2 was a unique weapon. It failed as a weapon of war, consuming vast resources for little strategic effect, but it succeeded brilliantly as a prototype for the future. Germany lost the war partly because it invested in the V2 instead of more jet fighters or tanks. The war forge of the Third Reich obsessed over the miracle weapon while ignoring the basics of logistics. They built a spaceship while their armies ran out of gasoline. Today, if you visit the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., you will see a V2 rocket. It stands near the entrance, black and yellow, menacing and sleek. Just a few yards away stands the Apollo 11 command module, scorched from re-entry, a symbol of peace and exploration. They are separated by 25 years of history, but they are connected by an invisible thread of technology and blood. The story of the V2 is the ultimate cautionary tale of the Warforge. It teaches us that science is not neutral. Engineering does not exist in a vacuum. A rocket has no conscience. It will fly for a tyrant just as well as it will fly for a democracy. The same equation that calculates the trajectory to London calculates the trajectory to Mars. The fire that burned in the ovens of the Holocaust and the fire that lifted humanity to the moon were kindled in the same era, often by the same hands. It is the duality of man, written in flame and steel. As we look to the future, to Mars and beyond, we must remember the lesson of Peenemünde. We must remember that the greatest achievements of engineering are worthless if they require the sacrifice of our humanity. The stars are not a place to escape our sins. They are a mirror that reflects who we truly are. The V2 was the first step on a long journey. A journey that began in the darkness of a tunnel and ended in the blinding light of another world.